Hello, everybody. This is our very first noon event, and I'm very excited to welcome those of you that were able to make the call. Please note that this will be recorded and available for a limited amount of time so that we can share it out. Thank you so much for that, Phyllis. If this is your first time to the Glenbard Parent Series, I welcome you most heartedly, and I do hope you will come back again. If you go to the website, you'll note that this is our 25th year. And because it's the 25th year, we brought back all of our favorites, as many as we could fit in. But then we had a few very special newbies, and that's Phyllis. But I can see now that Phyllis is no longer a newbie, that Phyllis will be back again and again, because we really heard some wonderful things, Phyllis, about your talk yesterday.
Thank you.
That was also recorded. And so those of you who want to share it with your families, please feel free to do that. You'll be able to find it soon on the glenbardgps.org website. It will be on Phyllis's page, which we will soon see as a past event. We're doing another event like this, noon, with John Duffy. Thanks, Jerica. So you'll see John Duffy is coming to us on January 27th, doing a program at night. And then at noon, he will be talking on January 27th to those of us that are on the call and others who can come back, professionals in the schools and outside of the schools as well. So spread the word. GPS events are always welcome. No registration. They are open to homeschool, parochial school, private schools, everywhere. We're just delighted to share and welcome everybody to this great resource. So thank you so much. That slide also noted a program we have coming up next week on rail safety. And we also have Jason Washburn, who is Jason Washburn is a psychologist at Northwestern Medicine and a consultant at Amita Health. Dr. Lanny Wilson, who will share a personal story, not about a suicide, but Dr. Washburn will discuss suicide. And then we'll have several rail experts as well. This program came out of a need in our community, and I hope you'll spread the word on that. So last night was a great fun night. We learned lots of things. We wrote lots of notes. And so I'm looking forward. I have my pages. I have more pages ready today. I ran out. So I'm ready for that. Please feel free to use the chat, to use the Q&A, and we will be able to ask some questions after Phyllis completes her presentation. Phyllis Fagell has worked in both public and private schools with students in K through 12. She currently works full-time as a school counselor for the Sheraton School in Washington, D.C., and provides therapy to children, teens, and adults in private practice at the Chrysalis Group. She is the author of this wonderful best-selling book, Middle School Matters, 10 Skills That Children Need to Thrive in Middle School and Beyond, and How Parents Can Help. She's a well-respected journalist, and more every day. People just really look for your articles, Phyllis. She's a contributor to the Washington Post, focusing on counseling, parenting, education. She regularly appears on national television and in national print media. She attended Dartmouth, Medill School at Northwestern, Johns Hopkins for her MS in counseling. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland. She has children who range in age from 18 to 11. And we couldn't be more excited to welcome Phyllis Fagell to the Glenbard Parent Series this afternoon. So welcome all. Thanks, Phyllis. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that nice introduction and for inviting me. It is my first time, but I have been having so much fun already. I enjoyed last night, and I'm always excited to talk to educators. It's one of my favorite groups to speak to, especially if there are any school counselors like me in the group. That's great. I'm going to just share my slide, make sure that works. Okay, good. So I am here to really talk about how you can bring out the best in your students. And if many of you, I'm sure, are also parents, so also in your children, there's so much overlap between what works at home and at school. And I am zooming in from my school in Washington, D.C. And so I'm very much aware that you are here instead of feeling glued to the TV screen. So I appreciate that too. And it's just such a tumultuous time to be raising kids and to be raising middle schoolers in particular and to be educating them. I feel like this age group in many ways has it the hardest because it's a developmental imperative for them to pull away, to identify more with their peers, to socialize, to exercise agency, to feel they have a sense of control. And all of that has really been stripped away because of the pandemic. And then you layer on everything going on in the news, and it's just so much for adults. And it's very overwhelming to tweens in particular. So before we can do anything, we have to have a good relationship with our students. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how you can set the scene so that when you do have a crisis, when they do act out, when they are struggling in school, you have that trust and you have that ability to get in there and support them. And you will be their chosen adult to talk to. And the first is really to focus more on relating than teaching. And that just means give them opportunities to teach you something, to teach the class something, to share what they're interested in, to have some voice and choice over what they're learning, and to view them as a source of information for you, and also to really treat them as the expert in their own lives. When we treat kids as if they're a little bit older and more mature than they are, and really show them that respect, they tend to rise to the level of our expectations. And any child who feels respected is much more likely to take risks as well in the classroom. We also want to be really aware of how often tweens misinterpret feedback, and they're never going to misinterpret it as being more positive than you intended. A very neutral comment can be interpreted as negative, and that can really interfere with the teacher-student relationship. They get it wrong about 40% of the time. And one way to make sure that you are transmitting that lack of judgment is to start from curiosity, to ask open-ended questions, to use phrases like "I wonder" or "I've noticed" instead of "what were you thinking?" And to ask a lot of open-ended questions that don't in any way suggest that we have an agenda. We also want to make sure that our body language, the tone we use, the words, everything that we're doing is all in alignment. So if you tell a student that if a student makes a mistake and you wait a full minute before you tell them that it's okay and everyone makes mistakes, all they're going to remember is that long pause. They're going to pick up on that inconsistency, and it's going to feel inauthentic. And we want to make sure, especially now that we are sharing our calm, we know that emotions spread through a social network. And we also know that no one is doing particularly terrific right now. And kids are really looking to the adults in their lives, especially their teachers, to help them make sense of what's going on, to help them gauge how alarmed they should be about everything that's different, everything that's changed. And last, we want to make sure that we are creating a really positive relationship with parents and caregivers, and that they don't think that we are judging their child. One of my favorite things that my middle school principal does at the beginning of every school year is he has a meeting with the parents where he tells them every single one of your children is going to either lie, cheat, hit somebody, or make some kind of a mistake that requires a call home. And I want you to expect that call. I want you to know that when I call you, it's because we want to partner with you. We want to help your child grow from the experience. There's no judgment. I don't think they're a bad person. And really front loading that kids in this age group tend to make more mistakes than kids in other age groups. They're impulsive, they're trying to impress, there's a lot of interference, they don't want to look like an idiot in front of their peers, and all of that can lead to some poor choices. It's why I have an entire chapter in my book on lying. That in and of itself is its own thing. And I say that with love and as the parent of a 12-year-old 7th grader myself. So in the book, I do talk about the 10 skills kids need to thrive. And I'm just going to pull out a few for right now because I have a lot of information to get through. But I wanted to talk about 2 that I think are really important during the pandemic. The first is to help kids make good friend choices. As we are all seeing, kids are really struggling. Their rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, suicide are going up. We already know that kids in this age group, the suicide rate has doubled between 2007 and 2014, and that was before the pandemic. And we want them to be surrounding themselves with people who make them feel good and to recognize who is a good friend choice for them. And they're making a lot of mistakes. I always share statistics with kids about how much churn there is during the middle school years, partially because I want them to understand that it is normal to lose a friend. Yes, it's real heartbreak, but it's really normal, and it's not personal. It's not a personal attack on them. So I let them know that only 1% of friendships make it from 7th grade to 12th grade. I tell them that only 2/3 of friendships that start at the beginning of 6th grade make it to the end of the year, that if you ask kids to nominate their best friend, only about half of those nominations are reciprocated. And I tell them that about 12% of 6th graders don't have anyone list them as a friend. And that's all been shown in research. And so on the face of it, that sounds really alarming and upsetting, but we want kids to recognize that this is the hard work they're doing now. They're figuring out how to choose a friend, how to be a friend. And one of the ways that we as educators can support them in that is to pair them thoughtfully, to ask questions that get them thinking a bit critically. If we notice that they are hanging out with someone who is leading them to make more poor choices than they might with other particular kids, or we can make an observation. I notice you're not yourself when you're with that particular child. And we can also help them with their social skills. I think one of the things educators shy away from is actually offering concrete suggestions. And you don't want to shame a child in front of their peers, but if you see that they're struggling, we do want to do whatever we can to set them up for success. And so online, that might mean making sure that they have inclusive, brief, structured opportunities to connect with peers. It might mean that we pull them aside after to say, I noticed that your friend's attention drifted away. I wonder if that's because you were talking about something that didn't relate to what they were talking about. Next time you might try listening for a few minutes and then ask a question and see if you get a different response. If the question relates to what they're talking about, everyone likes to talk about themselves. So that level of support can often be really helpful to kids in this age group. I want to talk about number 3 too, manage a student-teacher mismatch. And this is related to that whole concept that kids are misinterpreting feedback. But as a school counselor, I can't tell you how often students will come to me and say, my teacher hates me. And I always take it at face value at first, although at this point I recognize that 99% of the time their teacher does not hate them. And I say, tell me more. And I'll give you an example of one student who said, she doesn't call on me when she's giving an extra point. She will give it to someone else who had the same exact answer as I did. And I think she's targeting me and she hates me. And I'll say, okay, well, I'll tell you what, I will go in and I will observe and I'll tell you what I see. And I won't let anyone know why I'm in there. I'll just sit in the back. And so I went into this particular student's classroom and I sat in the back with an open mind and watched. And I did this on a few occasions. And I really saw absolutely no evidence that this teacher did not like this student. And so I called the student back in and I said, I'm not questioning how you feel, but I really want to understand better because I didn't see any signs that this teacher disliked you. And it turned out that at the very beginning of the year, she had asked for an extra point on a quiz and the teacher had an annoyed reaction. Maybe she thought the student was grade grubbing or making an issue where none was necessary and was annoyed. And the teacher was only annoyed in that moment. So when I followed up with the teacher, she didn't even remember the incident. And so the solution really for that in that particular situation was to make some time for those two, to carve out some time for the two of them to have lunch together. Right now that would have to be on Zoom, but the bad news is that they misinterpret feedback. The good news is that it's really, really easy to repair those relationships with just some organic, caring interactions. Number 6, self-regulate emotions is incredibly important right now. One of the questions I'm urging educators to ask, and it doesn't matter if you're a math teacher, if you are an advisory teacher, if you're a health teacher, a counselor, but at least a couple times over the course of the year, ask your students, if you were in a crisis, who is the adult you would go to for support? And I also will define anxiety and define depression to help them understand when they might need support. And I do this for a few reasons. The first is that kids are struggling so much right now. I'm seeing such an uptick in suicidal ideation, even among my own students, even among students who haven't struggled in the past. But kids in this age group are really bad at recognizing when they need help. They're even worse at asking for help. And when they do ask for help, they tend to ask their friends who already are overwhelmed themselves and don't know how to support them properly. So I want to normalize asking for help. I want them to think about who that adult would be when they're not in crisis. I want to really underscore that there are situations where you should be going to an adult and not a friend for help. And I want to flag for kids when they should get help for their friends. And I have never done that in a classroom and not had at least 2 kids come in to talk to me afterwards, just to either let me know that they needed support or to say I couldn't think of anybody. And I always offer to help them come up with an adult who can support them if they couldn't think of anyone in that moment. And I'm clear that it doesn't have to be me. It could be somebody else, and I'm happy to help them think that through. Number 8 is make responsible, healthy, and ethical decisions. And so many kids are impulsive right now. And so much of what they're doing online leaks into the classroom, whether it's an online classroom or a hybrid classroom that's sometimes in person. And so I'm also really reminding kids to stop and think before they post or say anything. I'm letting them know that everybody is hypersensitive. Everybody's feeling a little more jealous. They're feeling jealous about things that could be as simple as someone getting a new puppy or someone having a sibling. I'm seeing that play out in ways that I haven't seen it play out in the past. Kids who are really outgoing, who are not getting that social feedback that they crave and really rely on, are making poor choices in a bid to get attention. And I'm just explaining to them why they might be tempted to do something impulsively. And we want to set them up for success. So I'm reminding them, take the electronics out of your bedroom so that you're not snapping when you're tired, or texting to a group chat when you're not in the right place, or responding impulsively, and just doing whatever we can to underscore that everybody needs some extra support right now. I had a student the other day, she was very unhappy with her new cohort. We had just changed cohorts, and I'm actually in the school building right now. We are in a hybrid program. After the break, we were virtual for a week, and now we're back in hybrid. And she was so unhappy, and she was sure she was going to hate the kids in her group, and that the kids in her half group were going to hate her. And I validated how she felt, which is always important. You know, if I thought that the students in my class all hated me, I'd be pretty upset too. And I'd be dreading going back to school. And then I asked her if we could give it a day and see how it goes. And I told her I would check in with her. And at the end of our first day back, which was actually a Tuesday in person, I found her, and I was expecting her to be really unhappy. And it turned out that one of the students who she thought hated her had left her a gift on her desk. It was a note and something that she had made. And the note said, "I'm so glad you're in my half group." And it was such a good reminder to me how often kids misinterpret feedback and how quickly they shift gears. That was all it took. And so we want to constantly be looking for ways to help kids assume positive intent. One of my favorite ways to do that is the reciprocity ring activity. And that's something that Adam Grant talks about doing with adults in the business setting. I like adapting it for kids. You have kids write down on an index card something that they need or want but can't do for themselves, and they don't put their name on the card. And then they spread the cards around the room. And then I say to the students, I want you to walk around, read what kids have written on their cards. And it could be as simple as a book recommendation, or it could be something like, I'd love to talk to other students who are adopted, or I'm having a really hard time with current events and could use some help with that. Or I'm looking for people who are willing to play video games online with me. It can really be anything. And I explain to them, put your name on the card, your initials, if you're willing to help, but only put your name or initials on that card if you're willing to help anybody in the entire class, even the person you dislike the most, even the person you find the most annoying. And I also tell them to write "me too" if it's something they can't help them with, but it's something that they also could use support with. And I collect the cards, and I let the kids know that if their card is empty, they can come to me. We will find someone else in the school who can support them. But so far to date, I have never had anyone's card be empty. And that first time I did it was really the most moving, because I went through the cards, I read out the issues, and I got to the last card and it said, "As soon as you read this, everyone's going to know exactly who I am. I have no friends. I have nobody to hang out with. And I'm looking for someone who will be my friend." And every single kid in that class, including a couple who I think other kids would have guessed would not have been willing to do this, put their name on that card. And afterwards, when I read them, I told them to pay attention, because I didn't know which problem or issue went with which kid, and they were going to have to remember which kids had offered to help them. And at the very end, a few came up to me and wrote the names of the people who had said they could help them in Sharpie on their hands. It was a really meaningful activity. It was a way to really prove to them that everybody, when given an opportunity, is going to rise to the occasion to help one another. And we do want to establish that trust. It will make everything else work better. And the last one I'll share from this list before I move on is number 7, or actually number 10, create and innovate. And this has to do with risk taking. And we know that kids' creativity drops an additional 12%. It starts dropping at age 5, but it drops an additional 12% in those middle school years. Their confidence that other people like them drops about 30%, 46% among girls. They struggle even more with that. So, and we know that every single middle schooler on the planet is insecure and vulnerable. And so things like getting up in front of the class are really, really scary. I've had a lot of students come looking for support to even speak up in a Zoom class. It might not seem like it's that tricky, but they don't know if somebody is going to judge them for what they say. They don't know if somebody's recording it or taking a screenshot and they'll share that embarrassing moment. They feel exposed in a way that they don't actually feel exposed in the classroom setting. But what I have students do, and I explain to them that the best way to extinguish a phobia is through small exposures. And so what I want them to do is first, on a scale of 1 to 10, rank the risk. Where does this fall? And I had a student yesterday tell me that speaking up in a Zoom class was an 8. And so then we want to have them come up with a brave goal. And their brave goal clearly was to talk up in class. That was what they were really struggling with. And so I said, well, what would constitute a risk in the 4 to 7 range? That to me is a sweet spot, because if they take too big of a risk and it doesn't go well, then for the rest of their lives, their fight, flight, or freeze part of their brain, their amygdala, is going to say danger, danger. And if they don't get themselves out of their comfort zone enough, it reinforces the idea that they can't do it. And so for this particular child, she started by writing questions in the chat. She started by responding to other comments that people made. That was the 4 to 7 range. And ultimately, she worked up to that brave goal of trying to speak up at least once a week in the Zoom classroom. And I do the same thing when we're in person and kids are having a hard time presenting in front of the class. I've had students tell me they can't do it, but what they can do is present with their back to the audience, or present to the teacher and a few friends, or read their notes. I'm actually not that interested in what they choose. I'm happy to hand them the reins and let them tell me what's in that 4 to 7 range, because as long as we're progressing, I want to keep them moving in the direction of that brave goal to get them where they want to be, because kids do want to feel that mental strength. And it's such a key part of resilience, much in the same way that social skills are a key part of resilience. So these are just a couple of quotes that I'm hearing, representative quotes that I'm hearing from kids. This first one was actually right after the attack on the Capitol. One of the student's teachers knew that she was struggling and told all the other teachers. And the kid came to me and said, could you tell the teachers to stop asking me if I'm okay? I was okay telling that one teacher that I'm not okay, but I really don't want to talk about it with everybody else. So recognizing that kids will disclose what they're comfortable disclosing, they often will easily feel overexposed, and letting them take the lead in approaching us. We can ask questions like, how are you doing? Or what word best describes your mood, that allow us to take that mood temperature, but we do want to let them come to us as much as possible. Nothing bothers a 7th grader more than asking, are you okay? Are you okay? One of my favorite quotes from one of my 7th graders was, she came in and said, I hate that question. And I said, why do you hate that question so much? And she said, because I never say anything but I'm fine. And we know that that's the biggest lie I tell, is that I'm fine. I'm not fine. But once I've said I'm fine, I feel like I can never say I'm not fine again, that the moment has passed. I've lost my opportunity. The second comment here is, I'm always worried and I'm totally disorganized. We know middle schoolers they have no ability to do future planning, to predict what today's work effort, what impact that will have on their future product. Often parents will tell me they're worried their kids are lazy. Usually it's just that they don't have that future planning ability, or they don't have the executive functioning skills. All of that contributes to kids' anxiety. Sometimes that ends up manifesting as procrastination or avoidance, and sometimes we see it as perfectionism or perseverating. But right now I'm noticing everything you can imagine has been heightened, from perfectionism to school refusal. All of that is really on the rise right now. I have a Worry Busters group, and I had one kid tell me that she was really, really worried. And I said, I'm wondering why you haven't been coming to Worry Busters. Have you thought about joining that group? And she said, I'm worried that I'm not worried enough for worry busters. And I said, you're going to be just fine. That's the right group for you. But even that in and of itself, just that self-consciousness that she was worried she wasn't worried enough for a group on worrying. I feel like that captures middle school kids so well. And the last one here is that about kids' performance in school. And a lot of kids have seen their grades take a nosedive. They don't have the attention, much like the adults around them. They have COVID brain fog. And I think we need to be setting them up for success, giving them a lot of reassurance, helping them preserve their self-image as a good student, and separating that out from what their performance might look like in this moment. We have no idea what's going on in kids' homes. And sometimes when we do, we can appreciate fully why getting their work done or being able to focus on school is such a challenge right now. So I want to talk a little bit about optimism, which I think is such a key part of helping kids navigate middle school. Middle school in itself, I think, is a hero's journey. You know, books like Harry Potter that feature a character that go on an adventure, experience bumps in the road, and then come out on the other side changed and hopefully stronger for their struggles. Those books, the children's books about RBG and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a lot of those have that hero's journey narrative as well. Wonder, Hoot. I love sharing those kinds of books with students because it mirrors exactly that middle school experience for them. They are hitting so many bumps in the road right now. And then that is layered on top of a pandemic, an increase in racism, anti-Semitism, political divisiveness, just one piece of bad news after another. And so it's even harder to help kids be optimistic, especially since, going back to that whole concept that kids only do as well as the adults around them, I think so many teachers are struggling right now. The research on uncertainty shows that for adults, being threatened with job loss, having that job insecurity actually can be more uncomfortable than losing your job. And if you give people a choice between knowing they're going to get a painful electric shock and telling them there's a chance that they're going to get a painful electrical shock, many of them would rather just get the shock and get it over with. We really don't like uncertainty. We are wired to try to resolve that uncertainty. And right now we cannot resolve that uncertainty. And that's something our students are experiencing as well. So we want to give them back some sense of control, to teach them decision-making skills, to help them be proactive. I like the steps approach. So it's state the problem, and then it's think about alternative solutions, or think about solutions, period, and then explore the pros and cons of the options you came up with. Pick a solution and then pick a backup solution. And we want to be teaching kids anticipatory decision-making skills as well. If you don't get into the play, what are option B and C? Maybe you join the stage crew. Maybe you take an acting class outside the school setting. And then what are some positives about choosing B or C? Is there anything good about choosing B or C? And that really also has to do with the power of and. And the power of and, I think, is really powerful. A psychologist I spoke to recently was sharing that many of the tweens he's meeting with are telling him that they hate the social isolation. They hate not seeing their friends. But on the other hand, they have suddenly had this dawning realization that for their entire lives, they've defined who they are based on their academic performance. And maybe that's not what they want to be doing. Maybe they don't want to spend their entire life focusing on building a resume. And right now, all of that has been stripped away. So it's that both and going on. Yes, and it's realistic optimism. Yes, this is hard. Yes, there's no question that you are missing out, that your life is disrupted, that there are so many interruptions, and there might be some positives. There might be some takeaways or things you can learn, some insights you can gain, and that will serve them for the rest of their lives, high school too, but also the rest of their lives, because all of us go through what the author Bruce Feiler calls life quakes, and we go through 3 to 5 of them in our lifetime. And that's a major disruption or trauma, something like the pandemic, that has aftershocks that can last 5 years or more. And we don't actually spend a lot of time forging transition skills in ourselves, let alone in our students. And we, of course, want to shield them from discomfort. We want to make their world perfect, but right now we can't as much as we would like. But the silver lining, or at least the shade of gray, is that we are preparing them for what life really looks like, that life is not a straight line. I think it's really powerful when teachers share their own setbacks. In Australia, at Ivanhoe Girls Grammar School, they have an entire week devoted to failure. They call it Celebrate Failure Week. At the beginning of the week, the teachers beam on TVs into the classrooms, sharing their biggest failures. One of the teachers shared that they flunked out of education school and had to go back and try again before they could be a teacher, which is such a powerful example to give students. And then what they do is they spend the week teaching the kids really arcane skills like juggling or reciting medieval poetry. And at the end of the week, they all get on stage and perform those skills for their classmates. And none of them, I mean, there are skills like jousting, none of them can do it well. They all look silly. Everybody is laughing. It really normalizes that it's okay to make those mistakes. A much simpler pared down version of that, especially if you're online, is just to have a conversation once a week where kids share their biggest failure. And I think it's super powerful right now to really reinforce this idea that no one's life is a straight linear path from point A to point B. We want to use when, not if language. You know, language is so important. We saw that in the past week with how people talked about the current events. We want to make sure that we're saying when things are back to normal, not if things are back to normal, or when we're able to interact with our friends in a more organic way. This is what we'll be doing. And I really try to remind myself to incorporate that language as much as possible because they do internalize that message. And the last one here is to create consistency, but also add novelty and fun. And we know that the same tween, the same middle schooler can be 13 going on 3 or 13 going on 30, depending on the day. And as much as they love to be told jokes, they like to make other people laugh even more. And so we want to be giving them opportunities to have fun. We, in my school, because we're hybrid, we had to separate everybody out across the school, and we had to turn our cafeteria and we had to turn our gym into modular temporary classrooms, which means they have open air ceilings. And in the gym, it means that lining the classroom are basketball hoops. And the teachers, instead of just pretending they weren't there, found ways to incorporate them into lessons. So you get to dunk, ball up your worksheet and try to get it into the hoop once in a while. And in the open air cafeteria classrooms, they have opportunities every now and then, controlled opportunities to make paper airplanes with messages on it and fly it into the next classroom. So we do want to be adding that levity, making it fun, even as we're doing what we can to incorporate that consistency and that predictability that they crave, that knowing what to expect, especially at a time when it's really, really hard to know what's going to happen next. Okay, so more ways to instill optimism. We want to help them label what they're feeling, because if they can label what they're feeling, then they can do something about it. If all they can say is I'm overwhelmed or I'm totally stressed out, then they can't get to the problem solving stage. But if they can say I'm stressed out, and I'm stressed out because I'm really tired, and I'm tired because I'm doom scrolling through really grim news feeds late at night, well, then maybe the problem solving that they need to do is to get their devices out of their bedroom, or to not look at those feeds, or to limit how often they're looking at the news. So we want to be helping them get a little bit more granular in figuring out what's going on so they can get to those steps, get to that problem solving. Writing it out. Research shows that kids who journal or write about positive and negative experiences do better. As things are unfolding, we do want to give them an opportunity to talk about it if they want. I've had students tell me that their parents are talking ad nauseum about current events at home, and the last thing they want to do is talk about it more at school. They're very familiar with what's happening, but school to them is a break. And on the other side, you have kids who nobody's talking about it at all, and they're looking for someone to help contextualize it, or even define some terms that they had never heard before. With middle schoolers, to help them problem solve, we need to give them some distance. They're often the worst at coming up with solutions for themselves. I will either take kids up on a hot air balloon ride. Imagine you're looking down on the problem, and from your perch in the sky, what happened before, what might happen after? Can you see any solutions with that distance that you couldn't see from the ground? Or I'll ask them, how would you advise a friend who had the same problem? And it's really amazing how that loosens their thinking. Another way to loosen their thinking, by the way, is to say, well, what's the worst idea you can come up with? And they're like, why are you asking me for the worst idea? And then once they give you that worst idea, I'll say, what are 2 good things that could come out of that worst idea, or 2 good ideas that could come out of that worst idea? And often the most creative solutions come out of the best parts of the worst idea, and it just loosens their thinking. I talked a lot about how ranking risks and assuming positive intent and avoiding making mistakes. We also want to make sure that kids really don't globalize. So it's not that if you fail a math quiz, it's just you failed one math quiz, and the sun will still rise tomorrow, and we can do some problem solving to figure out what you learned from that process of failing that one math quiz. It does not mean that you're a horrible student, that you're always going to be bad at math, that you're going to fail at life. And middle schoolers tend to really catastrophize and go straight to that worst case scenario. And we want them to understand that there's something they can do, that's that proactivity, and it's temporary and situational. All right, I have a whole lot of strategies here. Some of them I've already gone over. I'll just share them rather quickly. The first is a way to challenge distorted thinking. I like to use the metaphor of a dartboard. This is a magnetic dartboard. And I explain to kids, and as we're talking, I'm having them actually throw the darts because it's fun. And anything you do that is fun and relationship building will also help them understand or internalize the concept that you're teaching. But I explain to them that we all tend to err on the side of negative thoughts, or to discount the positive, or to think in black and white. And we need to challenge those thoughts. And so all of our thoughts are not going to hit the bullseye. They're not going to be in the middle of that dartboard. But what we don't want is for them to be on another wall altogether. And so as teachers, you can be listening for words like always or never to recognize when kids might be globalizing or catastrophizing in an unnecessary way. Mantras and coping cards. I will have kids write down something like, I've done hard things before, or just because I'm scared doesn't mean I'm in danger. Often I'll help them come up with it themselves. Sometimes they'll choose a lyric from a song that they like, and they can carry it around with them in their binder. And when they find themselves ruminating about something that's bothering them, they can repeat that mantra. Or if they're trying to achieve a brave goal, they can look at their coping cards before they try it. Activate parasympathetic nervous system. So one of the things that I think middle schoolers are really missing the most right now, and not all of them can articulate it, but I can really see it. And one of the ways I see it is because they're constantly saying COVID air hug. And I was noticing that how much kids are missing touch. And we tend to think about little kids that as needing that touch, second graders piling on top of one another on the playground. But I would argue that middle schoolers, and anyone who works with middle schoolers and sees them hunching over somebody's phone near a set of lockers understands this. They really need that bodily feedback just as much. And they're really missing that right now. So this activity I'll teach you actually has a bonus of helping them activate the parasympathetic nervous system and calm their body down, but it also addresses their need for touch. And what I do is I teach them to hug themselves. So instead of doing that COVID air hug, I say, hug yourself as the other person is hugging themselves. And it feels a lot more satisfying. And the magic number is apparently 8 seconds, according to research, that ideally they're hugging themselves for 8 seconds. And that's just something you can do in a class too, just during a break. The kids actually like it. And it satisfies a need, and it does calm them down. I also teach kids to press on the opposite hand with their thumb from the other hand, and that can activate the parasympathetic nervous system. But I usually use a lot of mindfulness strategies, but many of my mindfulness strategies don't involve touch. Like some of the ones that I like have to do with tossing a ball and counting, because having to retrieve language turns on the prefrontal cortex and turns off that panicky part of the brain. I will occasionally have them count their footsteps and pace, or I'll do ballooning where they try to keep a ball in the air. But right now I've noticed that what kids really need is that touch. And so I'm leaning more heavily on the things that involve grounding them in their own body, making sure their feet are on the floor as they're doing these activities as well. I will show them a Venn diagram and say, one circle is things that you can control. The other circle is things you can't control. In the middle, there's an overlapping part, things they can control and they care about. We want kids conserving their energy right now. So if they're upset about something, we want to help them identify if it's something they actually want to fix and if it's something they can fix, and giving them that sense of agency in whatever way we can at this moment, even if it has to do with tweaking their homework assignment in a way that works better for them or appeals more to their interests. We want them to be, again, focusing on pruning and preserving their relationships, not blowing up their friendships, not making poor choices. Have kids sit on their hands for a good 10 seconds before they post, long enough to ask themselves if it could come back to haunt them if someone took a screenshot, or if it could hurt somebody else's reputation. I ask them to imagine they have 1 million followers. What would you do if you had 1 million followers? How would you use your social media feed? I'll have them go through their texts or go through their social media feeds and pick out the one post that really doesn't reflect their values or that seems incongruous with the others. And it's a way to get them thinking a little bit more critically about how they want to present themselves to the world in a way that's positive as opposed to punitive, and in a way that relates to their own thinking as opposed to us lecturing them. For kids who are ruminating, I sometimes use a worry box. They write their worry down, and I literally give them permission to set it aside, to put it to bed. I got a worry monster for my younger students where they put it inside the monster's mouth and the monster eats the worries. And I've actually found that my middle schoolers like this more than the younger kids. If they're at home, you can recommend that they put their worries on an index card and stick it in the freezer, like literally put it in the deep freeze, but give them permission to set aside whatever they're worrying about, to take a break from their anxiety. If they say, I can't, that's when I do the white bears game. I ask them to think about nothing but white bears for 60 seconds. And then I ask them to think about anything but white bears for 60 seconds. And they will say, there's no way I can think about anything but white bears after thinking about white bears for 60 seconds. And of course I know that, but I still have them go through the exercise. And then they say, see, all I thought about was white bears. And then I hand them a deck of cards and I ask them to pull out all of the twos, and that takes a few minutes. And by the time they've pulled out all of the twos and a few minutes have elapsed, I'll ask them again, how often did you think about white bears? And they go, oh my gosh, I didn't think about white bears at all. And the point of that exercise is really to demonstrate to them that they have more power over their thoughts than they think. And they can change the channel. They can come up with a way to distract themselves, whether they get a drink of water, whether they bury their nose in a book that's escapist. But we want to be helping kids understand that they are not just a victim of their thoughts and feelings, that their thoughts and their feelings and behaviors are all connected, and there's something they can do about them. We also want them to be setting reasonable, attainable goals. As I mentioned earlier, I'm seeing more perfectionism right now. I think when kids feel like their world is imploding, they tend to try to focus on things they can control, like grades or eating. I'm seeing an increase in disordered eating as well. So I use the analogy of a ladder, and I'll show them a picture of a ladder, and I'll ask them what their goal is, and then I'll have them break down that goal into what I would consider to be more reasonable steps, because often they're shooting for the moon, and it's the perfect is the enemy of the good. In the meantime, they are completely neglecting sleep or friendship and all of these other things that are so important. And perfectionism is hard to challenge. And by the way, that ladder activity also works for kids who are really struggling right now with executive functioning. They can break down their assignments using the ladder in the same way that I use it to break down and help kids establish more attainable goals. Temporal distancing is along the same lines as what I mentioned earlier with the visual imagery, or how would you advise a friend? I'll say, imagine it's 10 years in the future and you're looking back on this time. What do you think you will think about it? What do you think you will have learned or gained? Or who do you think you will have helped? Or who will have helped you? And we're trying to give them that emotional distance. Right now, that clearly relates to the pandemic, but even when there's no pandemic, I like to use that exercise. Maybe they got in a fight with a friend and it just feels like their world is ending, and it's a way to help them pull their thoughts back to the middle. The maybe game is along those same lines. I ask kids who come to me who are catastrophizing, I'll say, maybe somebody didn't include them on a video game or in a Netflix party, group get together, and I'll say, well, what are 5 alternative explanations for why they didn't include you? And they don't have to believe the explanations, and they can even be absurd, but the idea is to get them to come up with them, to encourage them to exercise cognitive flexibility, to just even imagine what some other possibilities are. Maybe they thought someone else had invited you. Maybe they heard you incorrectly and had thought you were going to be out of town over the weekend. Doesn't matter what it is. The idea is to really just get them to come up with those alternatives and get in the habit of imagining that it's not necessarily that doomsday scenario. Okay, so this has to do with frustration. The feelings wheel there, by the way, is a great way to help kids label their feelings. Middle schoolers tend to go straight to angry or sad or happy, but we want them to recognize when they're discouraged or frustrated or bored or tired or lonely, and help them figure out how they can help themselves. But other ways to help them in the classroom setting, especially if they are unwilling to get started. I'm seeing more of that right now, kids who will look at the blank page and they just can't get any words down. And it's really, it's a different way of expressing perfectionism. In many cases, they're just so afraid of doing it wrong. And we want to help them get started, or they will immediately say they don't understand the directions and they won't be able to start without a teacher's help. And so you can say things like, I'll check in with you in 5 minutes, or you can come up with some other ideas that they can try, whether it's asking a classmate or circling and skipping the hard problems and coming back to them later, helping them figure out when they need breaks and scheduling those in advance, as opposed to having them just stop in the middle and say they've given up, working on that positive self-talk. About 80% of the messages we're saying to ourselves are negative. I like to have kids, and if you have students learning virtually, they can do this at home, write down some positive things about themselves on sticky notes and put it on the wall behind wherever they're working. And when they notice they're having those negative thoughts, to force themselves to read the positive things, whether it's, I can stick with frustrating tasks for a long time, or I'm a good listener. And you can help them come up with things that fall into that category. But it doesn't really matter what they come up with, as long as they are challenging their own negative thinking, because it takes about 3 positive thoughts to compensate for 1 negative one. So I'm going to share a story that has to do with kids making mistakes. And first I'll share a story about my own student it was a child who was new to our school. This was a few years ago. She had been bullied at her old school, and she came to us in part because she had experienced bullying, and she was a really, really kind child. And one day she did something that was inarguably cruel to a classmate. And I was shocked. It was so out of character. And when she came to talk to me, she was pretty stoic and her body language was guarded, and she really wasn't willing to engage in conversation. And I realized part of that was because of how I was engaging with her. I think she was feeling my judgment. She was feeling that, I think I said something like, I can't believe you of all people, this is so unlike you. And she just froze. She was, I think, feeling shame, and she was stuck in that shame. And so I tried something different, and I said, do you think you were your best self? And it was a phrase I hadn't used before. And there was an immediate shift in her body language. She let down her guard. She started to cry. She was willing to talk about it. She said it wasn't who she wanted to be. And then she was willing to engage in problem solving as well. And I actually happened to tweet that out because it struck me. It really stuck with me. That one phrase had this huge impact. And a few days later, I got a direct message on Twitter from a principal named Tom Adams in New York. And he said, you don't know me, but I want to share with you that I used that strategy, and I want to tell you what happened. And apparently a few days earlier, he had gone into the cafeteria, this middle school principal, and a couple of 8th grade girls came running up to him and said, Mr. Adams, come quick, so-and-so is crying. And he said, what happened? And they explained that earlier in the day, one of the boys in the grade had told her that this other boy was going to ask her out. And she was dubious. She didn't believe it because he was in a more popular crowd, but she kind of wanted to believe it because she did like this kid. And then they got to lunch, and sure enough, this kid did ask her out. And even though she wasn't sure really in her heart that it could be real, she wanted to believe it. And because she had been primed to expect it, she just took it at face value, and she agreed to go out with this kid and said yes. And then she started walking back to her table, to her friends. And by the time she got back to her friends, she could hear the table full of boys laughing really loudly and knew it had been a setup. And so that is what these 2 8th graders shared with the principal. The principal said he saw red. He was furious. He couldn't think of anything more cruel to do to a classmate. And he hauled them into his office, and he started to let them have it. And he experienced the same thing I did with my student. Those boys just froze. They would not admit wrongdoing. And at that moment, he opened his computer to take some notes and saw my tweet from the night before. So he took a deep breath, and he was like, I have nothing to lose. And he gave it a try and said, do you think you were your best self? And he had the exact same response that I had had with these boys who said, no. and they started to cry, and they were willing to call in their parents and figure out how to make it right. And that is key to helping middle schoolers when they make a mistake. You can validate, which doesn't mean you agree or approve. You can say, if I wanted to make my friends laugh, I might have done something stupid too, like flung a hamburger across the room. But, and that second step is where you tell them why it's not okay, but it was disrespectful, or but it was really hurtful, or it violates the contract we have with one another in this building. It goes totally against our culture. Whatever they have done, that whatever contract it violate, whatever social contract it's violating, but you cannot skip step 3, which that third part where you give them a runway back to being a good kid, where you help them be the person that they want to be, where you talk to them about what they can do to make amends, how they can make it better, what they can do to go forward, reassure them that there is a path back to being a good kid, not only in the eyes of the person they wronged, but in your eyes. Kids in this age group very, very much want to please their parents and their educators. They want to do well in school. If they're not doing well, either behaviorally or academically, odds are they're not feeling great about it. And that can manifest in antisocial ways or non-constructive ways, but we can help them get back on track by just acknowledging that we know they want to be a good person. One of the myths about middle schoolers, and why I wrote this book in the first place, that I want to dispel, is this idea that middle schoolers are somehow mean and drama seeking. I don't see them that way at all. I see them as really, really wanting to do the right thing, but not yet having those social skills and having that developing empathy. And that is why they need their teachers to get in there when they notice something, to help them do the right thing, to help them be the person they want to be, to help them understand that maybe that social risk that they are overinflating isn't as risky as they think it is. I was telling the parents when I did a talk last night that I asked my students why they might not stand up and say something if somebody used the word gay as an insult, which is something that seems to come up at least once a year with my middle schoolers. And one kid was honest, and he said, I'd be afraid they'd think I was gay, which obviously that is a problem in and of itself, that he would worry about that, but that was how he felt. And another kid said that he was worried that he would be targeted. So that's that interference I'm talking about. That is what is getting in the way of them doing the right thing. And then I asked them, what would you think about someone who stood up and who said something? And that's when the kid said, I would think they were strong enough to do the right thing, or they really are, they know who they are, or they know right from wrong, or they're really courageous. And so it was an opportunity for them to really hear from their own peers that this so-called risky thing to do, which was the right thing to do, was not only was it not as risky as they thought, but it would elevate them and earn the respect of their peers. And we want to be looking for opportunities to help them do the right thing, to show them how to do the right thing, to walk them through ethical dilemmas, to let the kids be the leader of those discussions as much as possible, and to be the teacher of one another. Because if there's one thing we know doesn't work with middle schoolers, it's lecturing them or telling them what to do. We really need to give them those critical thinking skills and walk through it themselves and help them anticipate what might get in their way and how they might respond when they are in that situation. So with that, I'm gonna actually switch to, I'm gonna stop sharing so we can switch to questions.
More notes, that's what I've got here. More notes, okay. So let's see. You know, there's just so much here, and I loved, and this was from your book, talk about basic friendship skills, reciprocity, reflective listening, turn taking, and sharing. How do I start that conversation?
In terms of how you have those social skills?
In teaching friendship skills, which, because in talking to middle school parents, the friendship issue, would you not agree? Is that like
everything? It's everything. Yeah. And we know that social safety network is so key right now. I am seeing, as much as I worried about my extroverts going into the pandemic, it's actually the kids with social skill deficits who have struggled the most. And we want to be doing whatever we can to help them develop empathy. One of the other, and I will talk about some concrete strategies, but one of the other, some of the other information I give middle schoolers, I share with them the data on popularity, that kids who are using aggression or meanness to attain status, that's really only adaptive until about 12th grade. After that, It leads to higher risk of depression, anxiety, job loss, less higher education, more failed relationships. The outcomes are really not good for kids who do not know how to make friends using those skills of likability, those active listening and reciprocity and generosity. But we cannot tell middle schoolers that directly. I give them that backdrop, that research, so that they understand why it's important. And then in order to teach the skills, I use social stories. And not only do I use social stories, I use real social stories. I use examples that came up the year before, or an article about middle schoolers at another school. It gives them that relevancy. It gives them that emotional distance. It's not directly about them. I'll share a story, that an actual situation that I shared in order to get them thinking about both the positive intent piece and trusting one another, but also what they want from one another. It related to a parent calling who was upset because her daughter's friend had just sent her a text. And in the text was a video that she had secretly taken of two other girls saying mean things about her that she'd overheard in the street. And the mother thought, what kind of kid, what kind of friend sends that to her friend? And I said to the mother, you know, I think she thought she was being a loyal friend. I know that sounds crazy, but I think she thought she was doing the right thing, that she thought she was telling her that she should know who her friends are and who her friends are not. And to test it out the next day in a 6th grade classroom, I shared this story. And I said, how many of you would have secretly videotaped those two girls saying something mean about your good friend? And almost all of them raised their hands. And then I said, how many of you would have sent the tape to your friend? And again, almost all of them raised their hands. And then I walked them through a series of questions just to get them thinking about it. I said, how many of you have ever said something mean about someone in a passing moment? And they all raised their hand. How many of you would want someone to videotape that and share it with someone? Again, you know, not a lot of agreement on that. How many of you have disliked a friend one day and liked them the next? Again, they all understood that concept. And then I asked, what can the girl who got the video do with that information? Can she unhear it? Can she fix it? And I asked them, would you want to receive that video? Would you want to know? Would you want to know, especially if those girls had only said it in a passive moment of gossip? And at the very end of the conversation, I asked them again, how many of you would share the video and how many of you would have secretly made the video? And almost nobody raised their hands. And I think that story really underscores that kids often make mistakes, not because they're not good people, it's because they don't know what they're doing. And so we need to be sharing these stories with them so that we can help them think it through. They have no life experience. They have no perspective. I like to do activities like the values card sort, where kids identify what their top 10 values are and then use those to guide their thinking in situations where they're not sure what decision they should make. And call them out in real time when you see it. You don't necessarily have to do it in front of their peers, unless it's something that's said that's impossible to ignore because it was in the middle of a class. But if you overhear something, or if you notice something and it's impossible for you to really get in there and do something right in that moment, pull them aside, don't shame them, and in a tone that doesn't have judgment, tell them what you saw and ask them how they think that person felt, and really use anything that's organic and real. In real time is even better, to help them understand what mistake they just made, or why it might have hurt someone else, recognizing they want to do the right thing.
There were 2 questions that came in actually last night that we didn't get to. One was from a parent about their child wants the black screen, and how much to push about that.
So, you know, this goes back to that whole idea of brave goals and ranking the risk. And asking kids what their goals are. So there are some kids who are not on the screen because they're afraid to be on the screen. And there are some kids who are not on the screen because there's a really compelling reason. There could be domestic violence in the home. There could be 5 family members trying to Zoom behind them. And so the first thing to do is to ask the child, do you want to be on the screen? Is that something you want to work toward? Is there something getting in their way? One time I heard from a student that they were not on the screen because their parents are divorced, and in one home they were comfortable, and in the other home they were not. And so they were not on either because they didn't want to be asked a question about the other home. They just wanted to be able to do what felt right. And if we don't ask that question, we're not going to know. And I do think that kids are more engaged in the lesson. I think it's far easier for a teacher to gauge understanding and to feel and to convey passion if kids are on the screen. Many times kids will tell me that they would be on the screen if everyone else was on the screen. So that we want to do what we can to pressure, to impose some peer pressure to make it fun. You can use Kahoot or games or come up with quizzes or ways to entice them to get on screen. Or if there's someone who has some social capital who you know is pretty confident and doesn't mind being on, to ask them to turn it on early to kind of get the ball rolling. But I do personally think we want to be paying attention to why they're not on screen, and if it's possible to get them on there to help them establish those brave goals and get them on. With that 4 to 7 range, I've had some students only put their forehead on or go on for the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes of class. And so working with those kids to help them figure out what they're comfortable with and how they can keep progressing toward being on screen. Because long after the pandemic is over and long after they're on Zoom, courage is transferable. You know, if you take a risk in one realm, it transfers to every other realm of your life. Even experimenting with making an omelet might help you try out for a basketball team later. So if they feel brave because they are able to be on screen or speak in front of their class, that's going to transfer to all kinds of situations that they experience in their life.
Mm-hmm. The second question from the parent was about agency, which we know is so important. In this case, the child has been recommended for the gifted program and doesn't really, their brother didn't have a good experience in the program. And so the daughter is thinking, maybe that's not for me. Of course, the mother knows the teachers are great. And so how much, so in this particular case, or generally about agency, does the child get to decide if they're going to do the gifted program?
You know, I think that to the extent possible, we want to at least give them the illusion of choice. Mm-hmm. So if that were my child, mm-hmm. I would want to connect them with kids who had a positive experience, who are maybe just 1 year older. They're a far more compelling ambassador for the program than that older sibling or the parent is in this situation. Maybe there is an opportunity to sit in on a class or to experience it, but to the extent possible, we would like them to come to that conclusion on their own. I'll use an example from my own child when she was in middle school. She was in 8th grade and she wanted to try out for and the story is actually in the book, she wanted to try out for the tennis team, but she wasn't going to. Mm-hmm. And the reason she wasn't going to try out is because she was afraid she wasn't going to make it. And so, you know, you don't win any contest you don't enter. you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, all of those aphorisms. And it was driving me crazy that she wouldn't try out for this team because she might not make the team. Because of course, you're not going to make the team if you don't try out at all. And so I was doing everything I could to convince her and getting nowhere. And eventually her brother convinced her to email the coach and say she might try out. He got much farther than I did, but it wasn't, she wasn't going to be compelled to try out. She was just opening the door a crack. And she did send that email. I think the coach must have missed that word might because he sent her back a ladder listing and told her when to show up to try out. And because she's a rule follower, at that point, it was really hard for her to not go. But when she got the ladder, she freaked out again because they ranked the kids 1 through 25 and she was 25. She truly was ranked as the worst player of the kids trying out, exactly as she had predicted. And this is why humor is so helpful with kids. I said to her, well, look on the bright side, there's nowhere to go but up. It can't be worse. And the way the tryouts worked is that every day you play the person above you. And if you beat them, you move up in the rankings. And even from the get-go, she knew there was no way she could make the varsity team, which is what the first round of tryouts was for, something her brother had convinced her to do. You start trying out for varsity. And if that doesn't work out, you can try out for JV. 12 kids were going to make varsity. Even if she had gone up all 12, she wasn't going to make it. But in the 7 days she tried out for varsity, every day she beat the person in front of her. And it completely boosted her confidence that she could take that risk on. And actually, when she went afterwards and tried out for JV, she made the JV team, which was all she had hoped for, or against all odds in the first place. So sometimes we really just have to figure out creative ways to get our kids to get out of their own heads, or to get our students to get out of their own heads, and to find other people to be the ambassador for us and to help us share that message. Probably the program would go a lot worse for her if she was there because her mom said she had to be. So that would be my last resort.
Got it. Got it. If my middle schooler is shy, how can I help them overcome the situation since everything's online now?
You know, shyness, there's a reason adults, even adults who are very shy as kids, are often not shy. And it's because shy is a phobia, like any other phobia. And the way to extinguish a phobia is through small exposures. And so much like the ranking the risks in 1 to 10, I would want to first help my child articulate what it is that they wanted to accomplish, or how it was getting in their way that they weren't on screen. Was it going to impede their ability to interact with the teacher? Was that lack of visibility possibly going to impact their social relationships when the pandemic is over because they haven't been interacting with friends? Help them articulate that it's getting in their way and they want to change it, and then help them come up with some reasonable, attainable goals. And as I mentioned with my student who is in that situation, she started by making comments in the chat. And the other thing she did was let the teacher know what she was trying to do. Mm-hmm. And so the teacher worked with her to come up with, she would preemptively tell her what a question might be, so she could at least feel confident that she knew the answer, and practice being on camera. So you can also work with the school to help them feel more comfortable.
2 other questions here. How can I help my kid make good friends? How can I help my 7th grader to focus? How can I help my kid to be his best self?
So nobody can focus particularly well right now. That's part of the challenge. I feel like COVID brain is very real. There's so many distractions. And as with anything else, we do want to validate that for kids. And then I love the question, how can I help you? I can see that you're disorganized. So you can make sure they have an uncluttered space to work, that they have checklists, that they have ways to stay on top of things. They don't have future planning skills. No middle schoolers have fantastic executive functioning skills. They do need support. I like the I do, we do, you do model, where you demonstrate how to do something and then you do it next to them as they do it, maybe sending an email to a teacher. And then the last step is for them to do it on their own. And really focusing on what they need in order to focus. Do they need to make sure that they run around and go get some exercise before they sit down to work? Do they need to take a break from the screen for a little while? What is it that is actually interfering with their focus? Are they spending too much time reading news stories and that's what they're thinking about? So we want to always, and whether kids are lying, whether they're not doing their work, whether they are acting out socially, whether they're making bad choices, figure out why they're making the choices. What is at the root? Using lying as an example with a young child, we know that it's fantastical thinking, it's creativity. It's just an expression of their imagination. But when middle schoolers lie, there is something going on. They want to avoid embarrassment, or they don't want to admit they don't know something, or they're trying to impress someone. And if we want to solve the problem, whether it's shyness or disorganization or making poor friend choices, we have to understand what is going on in their mind internally. And we may actually have to help them figure out what's going on internally. They may not even be in touch with it. And parents and teachers can share personal stories. Going back to the emotional piece of everything going on right now, I've had students say to me, can you tell teachers that you talk to that I don't want to share how I feel until I know how they feel. They feel vulnerable expressing their views or why they're struggling until they know that maybe the teacher struggles with the same thing, or the teacher has experienced the same thing, or the parent has experienced the same thing. So in addition to those social stories and those news article examples, tell your kids or your students stories from your own life. Tell them what's going on in your mind, in your internal life, not in a way that's inappropriate to share, but in a way that relates to whatever it is you're trying to impart to them.
I think you just answered this last question. How do you recommend de-escalating a quickly moving situation when a student is really frustrated and doubting themselves? If you're the only adult in the room, or if it's online, it's really, really hard, but we don't want to call students out. And so one of the most effective ways to manage that is to just pretend in that moment that the entire class is so frustrated that they're going to lose control. And that's a good time to stop and
have everyone do wall push-ups, or, you know, sit in their chairs and pretend they're swimming away from sharks, but just break the mood however you can, without calling out that one individual. I mean, that's how I've been doing it online, just because it is so hard not to shame a particular student or make them feel like they're in the limelight, which is so uncomfortable for middle schoolers.
I'm looking at all the thanks from people that have, someone asked about a handout. The video is going to be available from last night and tonight. I think you've done an amazing job for 2 days, and I can't thank you enough. I can't wait to have you back. I'm really grateful to all of those people that came to our very first noon program, and I do hope you'll be back when we welcome Dr. John Duffy on January 27th. Jerica's got a slide that she's going to put up that shows some of the other programming that we have coming up. We were just, Phyllis and I were just discussing some of our favorites, and she's going to see some of her favorites right here. So next week is Dr. Lanny Wilson and Dr. Jason Washburn talking with local rail safety experts on rail safety, a program we've never had to add to the GPS lineup, but there it is. Dr. John Duffy, the program at 7 p.m. for parents and noon for school staff. Ron Lieber will be kicking off a book tour of his new book, The Price You Pay for College, the biggest financial decision your family will ever make. Ron is the New York Times financial reporter. Being there with Sean Derrick, he'll speak to students during the day, 5 ways to actively engage young people. Then we're going to welcome Tara Westover with our community read. If you haven't read Educated, take a look at it. 2 days after Tara, there's another really valuable book. Phyllis and I were just discussing this, that will be discussed. Dr. Tyrone Howard, professor at UCLA in the School of Education, will be discussing his 2 books, All Children Must Thrive, Why Race and Culture Matter. There's a lot here. I hope you'll all come back. Phyllis, it was just a pleasure getting to know you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who came.
Applause.